Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Yeah, exciting day watching my daughter take her first, well, she's taken the odd step, but she actually walked today. So nice to be back at Findhorn. It's really nice to be in this space. I must have spent at least 100, if not 200 hours dancing 5 rhythms on this floor. So if I suddenly start spiraling, stop me. Yeah, let's start in the order of the slides. Just very briefly, this is where I come from, there, Mallorca. The reason why I like starting with this slide of planet Earth is it shows the atmosphere and how thin that layer of life, of biosphere actually is, within which we take our home and within which everything, every love, every war, every bit of human history has taken place. And there's not a thing that you and I can do that doesn't affect the health and wholeness of this place. And unfortunately, we've come through centuries and millennia of not being very wise about how we behave within that living planet. We are now in an age that some people like to call the Anthropocene, where we've become a geological force. We are shaping the planet and have an enormous impact on biodiversity, on climate change and all these issues. These slides might be familiar to you. This is the planetary boundaries graphic that shows that we're already beyond certain planetary boundaries, that if we don't draw back within the safe limit, we might not have a future. And there's lots of things coming together: ecological crises, economic crises, social crises. And my friend and mentor Fritjof Capra once said that if you follow the river of these crises upstream, you meet a crisis of consciousness, a crisis of perception, a crisis of how we see ourselves and our role in this living planet. Also, we're living on an incredibly unequal planet. If you sum up the 2 layers of this graph, which is produced by Credit Suisse, every 2 years, 8.6% of humanity own 85.6% of the wealth, which is staggering. But what's even more staggering is that 71% of humanity have to share 2.7% of the wealth. We cannot create a sustainable planet or a sustainable future for humanity with this inequity, and we wouldn't want to sustain a humanity that is that unequal. Just at the beginning of this week, the IPCC, the Panel on Climate Change, released another report saying, while we're completely off target on what was agreed in Paris with a 2-degree target, it's actually not enough. We need to radically reduce carbon emission and actually do more than that. We need to reverse carbon emission to avoid hothouse Earth. We're on this path, and if we don't manage to take the detour onto this semi-stable ledge, we're dropping into this abyss. And a lot of the voices, about two weeks ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations said that we've got about a year and a half to take drastic action. This report, again, very conservative, talking about 12 years. I actually think we're already in the middle of what's called runaway climate change. That image up there with the lakes, that's the permafrost melting. These lakes are bubbling like a little soda pop, off-gassing methane. And the circulatory currents in the oceans are slowing down. We're basically faced with a runaway cycle now where climate change is getting worse even if we start paddling back. So even if we do all the things I'm going to be talking about this evening, we are facing 3 decades of collapse, but that collapse is the collapse of an old system that no longer serves, that we need to go through in order to give birth to a new humanity that sees itself again as part of the community of life. So even if we get everything right, we'll still face 3 decades of quite severe upheaval. We need to go upstream and look at this crisis of perception. We need to start thinking about how do we retell the story of who we are, why we are here, and what we could do if we actually lived in a way that is creating conditions conducive to life. One of my mentors, Janine Benyus, the founder of the biomimicry work, says life creates conditions conducive to life. This is in a nutshell what we should be doing. I would also say that life in a nutshell is a regenerative community. We need to rejoin that community. And to do that, we need to change the stories we tell about ourselves, and we need to change the organizing ideas that shape our perception. And what do I mean by that? Have a look at that. Some of you are seeing the head of an animal. Some of you are just seeing a black circle, a white circle with black dots in it. If I give you the organizing idea, head of a giraffe, some people go, ooh, I can see it. This is the neck, these are the horns, this is the snout, the eyes, so she's looking down this way. This is just to show that organizing ideas are incredibly powerful. We don't see things because they're out there and they just come in. We see things because we have ideas about what's out there and we make the world. We bring forth a world together in conversation. And that's the power of reshaping the world for us as well. One of the big stories that we've been told is that life is all about survival of the fittest and the struggle for survival on a planet with scarce resources. That's not true. Life is a process that acts through diversification and subsequent reintegration of that diversity at higher levels of complexity. And more often than not, this is done through new forms of collaboration. This is what we are challenged to do now. We have to, and it seems impossible when we look at the current news in Brazil, in America, so many places we seem to be going in the exact opposite direction. But we have to, and this is really, let this one sink in, we now have to do the impossible because the probable is unthinkable and unconscionable. We have to do the impossible. So maybe it's good to be here at Findhorn, where one of the taglines is often, expect a miracle, we need one. Whoops, another good friend of the community, Robert Gilman, sketches it out in this way. He talks about the era, the tribal era that humanity went through, and then with the onset of agriculture, which to some extent was also the onset of us beginning to exploit the planet in a way that wasn't very wise. We became able to settle, and the era of empires started. We started to build cities, we started to create nations and empires that went to war against each other. So we began a war against nature, and then we began a war against ourselves. And then Robert speaks about this moving into what is called the planetary era. And what I like about this graph is that in many ways the Renaissance seems that with the scientific revolution, a new type of technology was made possible that then made it possible to destroy the planet much faster. But at the same time, through science, the same science that gave us destructive technologies also gave us an understanding of being part of this living planet. And this transition out of the era of empire into the planetary era, to us, with our 70, 80, 85, 90-year lifespans, seems very short, very long. But really, it's short for a complete transformation of our civilizational presence on Earth. And that sometimes gives me hope that we're now at the end of this large transition area, and that we just need to understand that what seems like nothing is moving is actually part of a larger process. So we are moving into the planetary era. This is me in 2006, just before I moved to Findhorn. The two big books in my hand are Volume 1 and Volume 2 of that PhD I mentioned earlier. Design for Human and Planetary Health, a holistic, integral approach to complexity and sustainability. Sounds very academic. What's amazing about this is that when I came to Findhorn, like when I finished the PhD, I couldn't find any way to do postdoctoral research because nobody wanted to fund me because it was too transdisciplinary, and I was sent from one funding council to the other. And so I kind of put it in a drawer, came to Findhorn, where to some extent I was, in those days even, it was good to hide your PhD because there was a bit of an attitude that if you had a PhD, you were in your head and therefore you couldn't be in your heart and you probably weren't spiritual. And it took a while to, here's a man who's lived this for 50 years, Roger. So I don't think it's like that. But yeah, just recently, this summer, I had a phone call from a man who said, my name is Anthony Capon, I'm a professor at the University of Sydney. I'm in Europe for a number of weeks because of 2 conferences, and in between those 2 conferences, I would really love to come and see you. And I said, okay, that's interesting, yeah, let's meet. And so he came to Mallorca, and he's the co-author of a report that came out in 2017 by the Rockefeller Foundation and The Lancet, the top medical journal, that is called Planetary Health. And this whole meme that I wasn't actually aware of because I stopped following it has grown enormously in the last 3, 4, 5 years. There's a whole field of medicine now that understands that there's a deep link between ecosystems health and planetary health. Health actually is, and comes from my PhD, is an emergent property of complex dynamic systems at different levels of scale. So a healthy cell sits in a healthy organ, in a healthy body, in a healthy family, in a healthy community, in a healthy bioregion, in a healthy ecosystem on a healthy planet. And of course it goes the other way around. If we do anything that is unhealthy at any of those levels, it affects all other levels. I came to call planetary health, or I kept working in this field, but a couple of years ago I published a book called Designing Regenerative Cultures, because this idea of regeneration is also about health. The idea of resilience is also about health. And in this book, the title of this book also kind of harbors a somewhat paradox, which is that on the one hand, we need to redesign the human presence on Earth, and on the other hand, cultures aren't designed. Cultures emerge through the interactions that we have with each other, the stories we tell. So in that sense, this paradox, I've learned from one of my mentors at Schumacher College that he said, if you step on a paradox, you can be sure to have some truth on your shoes. Life is much more complicated than linear either-or thinking. So when we work with paradoxes, we get closer to what truth is actually about. And the other thing that in writing the book, I realized very early on, I thought, what can I write in this book that would actually be meaningful in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years' time? And at some point I realized most of the solutions that human beings have created for themselves and for future generations were created with the best of intentions. And nevertheless, so many of them have turned into today's problems. So yesterday's solutions turn into today's problems. Who are we to think that our sustainable, regenerative, green, or whatever you want to call them, solutions will not turn into problems later on? So maybe we've got it wrong as a culture that questions aren't transient means to get to better answers and better solutions, but solutions and answers are transient means to get to better questions. And maybe a wise culture, when you try to create a compass that you can hand on from one generation to the next, would actually create a set of questions to give to the next generation. How do we fit in? Who are we obliged to? Why are we here? Where are we going? What is this all about? These questions need to find new ways of meaning. My mentor, David Orr, once floored me with the question of saying, Daniel, before we can find the answer to questions like how and what, we might have to do in order to create a sustainable human presence on Earth, we have to ask ourselves a much deeper question. And that question is, what is it about humanity that is worth sustaining? And if we find an answer to that question, then we might live our way into the future in a wiser way. Very briefly, what do I mean by regenerative? This spectrum is from a friend of mine called Bill Reed, who works with a group called the Regenesis Group. It's also been influenced by a woman called Carol Sanford. And basically it creates a spectrum from business as usual to green, which means doing things a little bit better, polluting a little less, using a little bit more renewable energy, which is part of the journey. And then we get to sustainable, which means no negative impacts, like not adding any more damage. But because we've done so much damage, we need to do more than that. So then you move into restorative, which can still be in a mindset that is humanity as power over nature, man and nature. I'm saying man on purpose because they've created most of the mess. And so you end up with situations where we try to create large forest plantations in the wrong place of the wrong kind of species, and then they like eucalyptus in a water-stressed area, and they look very nice for a decade or two, and then they die because we engineered an ecosystem. So once we do the reconciliatory step, shifting the organizing idea that we are actually nature, that we can design as nature because we're nothing but it. We are biological beings first and foremost. Then we move into working regeneratively. The oldest story of humanity or written story of humanity is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it tells how the king Gilgamesh was told by Humbaba, the forest god, that he was the all-powerful king, but he wasn't allowed to cut down the cedars of Lebanon. What did he do? Arrogant, won't say the word. He ordered himself a cedar palace and killed Humbaba and cut down the forest. A modern ecologist would call this downwind desertification. Humbaba's curse was, if you cut down the cedars, your rivers will run dry, your soil will go salty, and your empire will crumble. And that's precisely what happened. And so we now face having to go from this to this. And it is possible. These are pictures from the Loess Plateau in China. John Lu, who was here at a conference, documented this change. Over 14 years, the Chinese managed to turn an arid desert into a fertile and productive landscape. These are also all images from that area, and it's a very large area here. There's Beijing, and this is, we're talking thousands of square kilometers. We can heal the planet, we can heal ecosystems, we can fit back into the community of life and create bioregion by bioregion a more abundant place, move from competitive scarcity to shared abundance. This is a wonderful image of a guy called Robert Zooks, who basically maps the river systems of the planet. And if we move into a bioregional world, if we start regenerating bioregion by bioregion, this kind of map is very useful because the bioregional approach is an approach that fits humanity into natural patterns rather than the other way around. This was an event that I helped to organize at the Commonwealth. Lady Patricia Scotland, from she's the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, giving advice to 53 governments that together rule over 2.4 billion people, and most of them are under 30, and a lot of them are in the front line of climate change. And she's behind this idea of regenerative development. And we brought key practitioners of regenerative development from all over the world together. It's been a slow process in terms of what's come out of that meeting. That was 2 years ago, but a lot of people met and started to collaborate afterwards. What's directly come out is this platform called Common Earth that is giving advice to Commonwealth countries on how to do regenerative development and also showcasing best practice examples. There's an organization in the Netherlands called Commonland who's developed a strategy of how to finance large-scale ecosystems restoration and how to make it viable. Skip through this. The Commonland has 4 practice sites around the world where they're working with regional landowners to transform entire regions. One of them is the Altiplano near Murcia in Spain. And John Liu, the guy who also did these images of the Loess Plateau, has started an organization called Ecosystems Restoration Camp Foundation, which is basically inviting young people or anybody from around the world to come and learn how to be a restorer of ecosystems in that place. There's an organization called the Regen Network, which are working on using remote sensing, satellite images and sensors on the ground to really look at the before-after of regenerative work, because once you can quantify and prove that you have had a regenerative effect, there are now ways of finding funding linked to that. And they're also working with new cryptocurrencies to basically create large funding streams into regenerative practice. These are just more images of how they're doing it technically. And there's Peter Head, who used to run Arab Engineering, that did a lot of the early eco-cities. He now runs an organization called the Resilience Brokers, and they're starting next year on an ambitious plan to, by 2023, have worked with 200 city regions around the planet to build resilience based on this shift towards a more bioregional, biomaterials economy and the regeneration of ecosystems. You've probably heard of the book that Paul Hawken, who lived some years here at the community, or some time, he published this book, Drawdown, that lists 100 strategies of how to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. This is a lot beyond carbon. We shouldn't have carbon myopia, but right now we're faced with having to stop runaway climate change, and these techniques are proven, and governments are now beginning to roll out programs to work on this. This network by the Capital Institute that sets itself the goal of region by region creating regenerative economies has just launched last week. There are now 7 regional regeneration hubs of people working at the bioregional scale to build bioregional biomaterial economies, basically shifting us out of carbon. Our entire material culture is fossil fuel dependent, and we need to move into a new type of material culture that is biomaterial based and locks carbon into everything we use. There's an organization called Regeneration International that links farmers from all over the world who practice regenerative agriculture, and this map shows where these activities happen. It's an organization called, Lush, the cosmetic companies, runs the Spring Prize that I have the honor to be on the jury of. And every February we meet to give away £200,000 to organizations that do this work already. So there is some hope, there is some silver lining to the dark storm clouds we're facing. If you really want to stop watching the bad news, have a look at this website from the Buckminster Fuller Institute. My friend David McConville created a map that is a Google map, and you can click on it, and each point has a little video of a story of people actually doing regenerative work on the ground. And next year is the 50th anniversary of Earthrise, the first image from outer space of Earth rising above Moon. It's also the 50th anniversary of Buckminster Fuller's book, Operation Manual for Spaceship Earth. And I think we're getting closer to knowing what we need to do, and we're beginning to do it. In terms of education, I mentioned Regenesis. I'm now flicking through these slides very fast. So just to close, this is a great teacher who has, for years, Joanna Macy has known that the key thing that we need to change is upstream. The key thing that we need to change starts in the human heart, in the human relationship with the earth. And I love what she says there, is that, like, we've been on the path of destroying this planet for many, many years, probably about 5,000 years since the beginning of agriculture. But there's something happening right now that we're redefining our relationship to each other, to this planet, and the potential role of healing this planet. And I'm going to close with a poem that Joanna Macy translated by one of my favorite poets called Rainer Maria Rilke. And it speaks to our time. And it goes like this. Dear darkening ground, you have endured so patiently the walls we've built. Maybe you'll give the cities one more hour, cloisters and churches too. And those who labor, maybe you'll let their work grip them for another 5 hours or 7. Until you become forest again, and water and widening wilderness. In that hour of inexplicable terror, when you take back your name from all things. Give me just a little more time. Give me just a little more time, so I may love the things until they're real and ripe and worthy of you. So I invite you to all love life, love the opportunity of being alive. We don't know whether we're going to make this. We are undergoing a species-level rite of passage right now. And rites of passage mean that you're not allowed to know whether you're going to make it, otherwise they don't work. So we are facing a knife's edge of a future that is abundant, of collaboration with nature, or decades of decline and unspeakable, unthinkable situations that we want to avoid. And the way to start navigating the path towards the positive is to just be in love with life and each other every day a little bit more. Thank you.